two, 1 2 1 2. There we are. 1 2. Good, good. Thank you. All right, friends, we're ready to get going tonight. It's what I like to see. Everyone's talkative tonight, which is a good thing. You guys are much more lively than my 8 a.m. class. I'm just going to say, it's really helpful to come in. Hey, we are in John chapter 18 tonight, and let me say we have 3 more weeks left, including tonight. We have 3 weeks left. We'll end a week earlier than the students, than the kids. Some of that's because I'm actually going over to FCC Web City, where Lynn Ragsdale, some of you know him, where Lynn Ragsdale's at, and I'll be teaching the Sermon on the Mount, starting that, I think, Sunday, Wednesdays, and it's every Sunday, Wednesday night, starting that particular week. So I'll trade on you all and go over there and teach for a bit as well. So 3 more weeks, we're going to talk about the betrayal of Jesus and the trials of Jesus tonight. The crucifixion of Jesus next week, we'll get into some of the medical terminology, some of the historical artifacts, some of the bones we've found that have nails still in them, and some things like that that help us understand and reconstruct what happened at the crucifixion, in addition to then the spiritual, theological side of that. Then, of course, on the final week, talk about the resurrection. We'll talk about some of the historical evidence for the resurrection from a historian's perspective. We'll talk about, of course, some of the theological implications of that, and then some of the stories that happen kind of as the epilogue in John's gospel of especially Peter's restoration, which is important tonight because we're going to talk about Peter's betrayal. So we have a lot to cover. I know that it's 5 pages front and back on your handout tonight, but let me give you a bit of a review, a bit of a preview. We're in the second half of John's gospel, the suffering glory. So Jesus is about to be lifted up, but that lifting up is going to result in his glorification. So he's going to suffer. He's also going to be glorified. We just dealt with the farewell address. Last time we were together, Jesus is saying goodbye to his disciples. He's praying for them. So we are in John 18, and it's obviously something we would call the passion or the suffering of Christ. So I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to dive right into chapter 18. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity, really the privilege it is, the blessing it is, to be here and to have this conversation. God, we come and we need to be humbled at times, reminded at times of Jesus' sacrifice for us. God, we pray that tonight will not just be an exercise in mental facts and figures and historical details, but God, also one where we can enter into the story and where we can recognize the impact of the story on our lives today. God, may we walk away learning lessons from the disciples, even in their failures and even in their flaws. Learning lessons from those who are enemies of the cross of Christ in their failures and their flaws as well. And so, God, use it then not to lead us into temptation, but to lead us to Jesus. And so we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Last time we were together, we left an upper room about a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile inside the city to the Mount of Olives. And so you'll see in that first bullet point there called the setting, John starts out in John chapter 18, verse 1. He said, when Jesus finished these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, or the Kidron Valley, and there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. So the last time we were together, we said that Jesus leaves the city. If we're looking at the city topographically, you come out of the city by the temple. It's probably not that steep, but you go down through the Kidron Valley. There's a brook, creek there. It's kind of like Turkey Creek at Ozark Christian College. Not much of one, but there's a creek that's there in the Kidron Valley. But a very lush. There's still even today a lot of gardens and groves and those types of things there. There's a lot of cemetery. But he comes back up to the Mount of Olives, and somewhere here there is a garden. We know that garden as the Garden of Gethsemane. That name Gethsemane, as best as we can tell, means olive press. This is probably a private garden. Some scholars argue it's maybe even the private garden of John Mark and his family, the same family that owns the upper room that they may be meeting in for the Passover. That's just a possibility. But either way, it's likely a private garden, likely a walled-off private garden. Somebody owns property outside of the city. That's not a surprise. There is a cave that some archaeologists would argue is the location of this particular moment where Jesus and his disciples are going. They're also spending the night. That makes some sense. There are some artifacts / drawings in there that suggest early Christians venerated that particular site. I don't have a strong opinion on that. But I do tend to land with this idea of it being obviously a private garden, but this idea of it being somewhere where Jesus is retreating and alone with his disciples, prearranged, just like the upper room. So we're about a half a mile outside of town. The significance of this place I've alluded to a couple times. I want to maybe zero in on a little bit more tonight because of the theme of betrayal. Judas has already left. It was dark. And Jesus walks this route outside of the city of Jerusalem, outside the city of David, to the Mount of Olives. And you actually have some weird echoes. When David's son betrays him and wants to take over as ruler, raises up an army, comes into town, David has to leave town because of that betrayal. And I've given you 2 passages there, 2 Samuel 15:23, and then I skip over to verse 30.
And then 2 Samuel 17, verse 23, there's two characters. The first one is Absalom, David's son. Let's just listen and hear some of the echoes. The whole countryside wept aloud as the people passed by. They're parading to leave the city. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all of the people mourned on toward the wilderness. They're going toward the Dead Sea, out into the wilderness. Verse 30. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. He also, of course, had people, especially one person, hurling insults at him, right? And hurling literally things at him. And then we have this other advisor that was an advisor of David that betrayed him. Does this sound familiar? Like some of David's closest people betrayed him. One of Jesus' disciples betrayed him, a son, if you will, someone who was an advisor close to him, in fact, a keeper of the money. Well, 2 Samuel 17 says this. He says that this advisor saw that his advice was not followed, so he put his house in order and he went out and hanged himself. And you might just go, oh, like that looks familiar. You know that this is what Judas is going to do. We'll allude to this next week, but the timing of Judas taking his own life is likely the same time as Jesus' crucifixion. And yet the synoptics don't spotlight it at the same time in the narrative. Why? Well, because you want the spotlight on Jesus at the appropriate time. You don't spotlight Judas at the same time. But likely Judas takes his life during that same time window of Friday. And so one of the things we have to wrestle with is, how do we deal with our own sin? Do we think that we need to punish ourselves for our sin, or that Jesus' punishment, Jesus' death is enough? One of the things I'd argue that is a difference between how God takes sin and guilt and uses it to heal us is that he uses it to drive us to Jesus and our need for Jesus. Satan will use your guilt to cut your legs out from underneath of you and make you feel like you have to deal with your own guilt and shame. Judas never comes back around to realize his need for Jesus to bring that redemption. We're going to see Peter do that. Peter's going to actually come back around and be like, yeah, I can't carry this sin on my own. And so we'll see that process take place. So basically, one of the things I want to just set the stage for this evening is recognizing as we go out to the Kidron Valley, there's historical and emotional and spiritual overtones over this setting that we sometimes miss as this son of David, the Messiah, takes this same journey. I don't know if you've ever walked like where your parents or grandparents walked, and you're like, oh, this is where grandma took this journey. I don't know if you've ever done that, but this is that kind of a thing, right? This is where his ancestors experienced some of these same things. You'll notice in John's gospel, actually, as you read through it rather quickly, that there is something missing, right? The very next verse as we pick up is verse 2. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, and so, Judas comes out and meets him. And if you know the story well enough, you might be like, we skipped something. You ever notice that in John's gospel? You're like, we skipped the whole Passover meal. We talked about foot washing. We didn't talk about the food at all. John assumes that you've read the synoptic gospels. They were already written. He's writing later. Upwards of 20, 30 years later. Depending on how early you even date Mark, maybe later than that. So the other Gospels have been in circulation. He assumes you've read those, and he's going to allude back to that, because later Jesus is going to talk about that cup that the Father has given him to drink, that cup of wrath, right? Take this cup from me, but not my will, your will. John's going to allude to that cup in Jesus' statement, but he doesn't tell the story. He assumes you've read it. In literature, this is called intertextuality, right? It assumes you know some things about a piece of literature or a piece of history that's already been written down, and it can just go off of that assumption. So we skip over that prayer, although, maybe we should pause and go, Jesus aligns himself to the will of the Father, even if it means walking through difficulty. I think we're all aware of that. Luke's gospel records that in that prayer, Jesus' sweat drops like blood, is what he says. And here's the question I don't know the answer to. Did Jesus literally sweat drops of blood? The answer is maybe. Medically, it is possible to be so stressed that your capillaries break and you actually do literally sweat drops of blood. Luke actually says he sweat like drops of blood. So either he's saying he's so stressed that he sweat drops of blood, or he's so stressed that it was like he was sweating drops of blood. And I'm like, well, the point is the same. Jesus is in grief and turmoil, stress, and he knows what's coming. So that is the moment that we have, recorded in Luke's gospel as well as in the other gospels. So then Judas comes up, and this is where we're going to slow down a bit now. Judas comes up, and he has a group of people with him. if you are Jesus and you're standing, I don't know why I deleted this, I erased this. If you're standing and you're in the garden and your perspective is a valley between you, and then here's the city of Jerusalem, right? This is a detachment of around 600 people. If that word that the Romans used in their military is a precise word. Now maybe nobody probably counted and went 1, 2, 3, 4. But if it is, we're talking about 600 people or so. It's Passover, so there are some things we know about Passover. It's a full moon. I don't know if it's cloudy or not. Sorry, can't determine that. But it's a full moon. Jesus, at a previous Passover, was able to see the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Remember this? And part of the reason is it's a full moon, it's Passover. So we have the full moon. I don't know if the moon's out or not, but they're coming out. One of the reconstructive pieces or details we have is they're coming out with torches. I don't know, okay, but a lot of scholars speculate if you're looking at all, now if they're in a cave, maybe not, but if you're looking at all, you can see this. Now Jesus is actually not in the cave at the moment he's praying because he's stone's throw away. We kind of get the scene there. Can he see them coming? My hunch is, I reenacted this with my students at Ozark. My hunch is yes. He doesn't run away. He doesn't wake up the disciples and they don't run away. So they're coming out with this detachment. Now, some scholars debate whether or not these are groups of Roman soldiers. How did the Jewish leadership, the chief priests, procure Roman permission to take out this detachment? And I'll tell you how. Right next to the temple, temple in the city of Jerusalem, right next to the temple, right behind what would be the temple, if we're looking at this from the south to the north, right back here would be a fortress called the Fortress of Antonia, named after Mark Antony. Herod the Great named it in honor of him. This is where the Romans looked over the temple compound and made sure that there were not riots. They had riot police, let's call them that were ready to respond in a moment's notice. Remember in the book of Acts when Paul causes a stir and they think that he brought a Gentile into the sacred precincts of the temple, and there's a riot that ensues? Well, quickly you have soldiers respond to that particular moment, right? This would be true today when you have a crowd in a major city. Right, my brother-in-law used to fly a drone over crowds that were in major city, and that was part of his job. I have another relative who does that in New York. That's part of their job. And so they're it's not a drone, but it's a tower over the temple. And the chief priests have that power, that political connection to Rome to say, hey, we have a problem, a riot possibility, and we need to respond to that. These two terms actually that are used are more often used for Roman military units than they are Jewish units. And you're going to notice in John's gospel, he actually articulates there are like Jewish officers as well, a temple guard as well. So it's a cohort or a group of various groups of people. I do think that the chief priests have this authority to have Roman soldiers. So this first word we have in the Greek, and I put the Greek word there for so those of you who care, does describe about 600 men. And you know this about history, that in the Roman army, sometimes it's like, well, actually it's 480, 460, sometimes it's 600. It originally described 1,000 men. And then the captain or the ruler over them, the name there is Kili-Archos. So you remember the word arch, like as in arch-nemesis, the chief rival. This word arch means ruler, and Kilios is the word for 1,000. So this idea of the captain, he's the ruler of 1,000. So those of you who are in the military, I have been told that that's equivalent to like a sergeant in the military. And I don't know if that would be correct. But that's this person's role with this particular detachment or cohort, whatever language you want to use to describe that. They come out. Then we also have John describe the Jewish officers. Now, you need to know this, that other historians, Jewish historians, talk about the chief priestly family. We'll get to them in a minute. But talk about this chief priestly family as sometimes having what we would probably compare to like a secret police or a Gestapo or more mob or mafia kind of police, where it's like the fixers, okay? And actually, this is a problem in Jewish literature, where they look at the chief priests, not just this group, but others around them, and say they were so embedded with Rome that they had to sometimes be oppressive in their use of force. And so they had a temple guard that would go out and carry out. Now, sometimes this temple guard would go to a place of harvest and take the sacrifice, the tithe of that crop, and bring it back to the temple for the chief priestly family, rather than letting that tithe go to the local priests who were out in the community, out in the area. This is why Josephus says some of the priests were actually starving because the chief priests were so corrupt in taking some of the things that were supposed to be shared amongst all of the priests in Israel. So this same temple guard, they come out, and no surprise, they come out with clubs, they come out with torches. We see that. And then the third group that we see are just kind of a blanket term, Jewish officials. And we'll see them labeled a little bit later. There are Pharisees that are there. There are elders, which is kind of even more generic. And then there are some of their servants, in addition to the chief priests. Here's what's weird. Normally, the chief priests, right, the chief priests and the Pharisees are at odds with one another. This is like bad, this is kind of a bad metaphor. Democrats and Republicans having like a similar enemy, right? And you're like, whoa, you guys are working together? Because that's not how it's been working, just so you know. That's not how it's been going. So the chief priests, their kind of power is based in the city of Jerusalem in the temple. They're an aristocratic family appointed by Rome. They have a lot of similarities in worldview to the Romans. They have a lot of Greek worldview. They don't believe in the resurrection. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. That's a Greek idea, that resurrection, physical resurrection is bad. You wouldn't want a bodily resurrection. The Pharisees are the more conservative group. They actually want nothing to do with Greek ideas and nothing to do with Rome. They want to be more kosher, more separatist. They're not going to go so far as the Essenes, who actually just moved way out here out in the wilderness. But they're going to have their own kind of separatist feel to them. The fact that they're coming together and getting along, it's the enemy of my enemy is my enemy, that kind of a thing. So that dynamic is kind of a unique thing that's taking place there. Of course, one of the servants is going to lose his ear in just a minute. And so that's the group that is there. Next question, and then I'll open it up for questions for you all that I ask in your handout is, why did they do this in the secrecy of night? And I think you know most of the answers, right? I mean, what are some of the answers? Let's go ahead and just do this at your table. Without looking at the paper, what are some of the answers? Why would they do this, or why did they do this in the secrecy of the night? No cheating. Okay, go. All right. My hunch is you can pick up on this politically and all of the ramifications, right? What are some of the reasons you threw out there? You're going to get the bullet points that I put on the page. But what are some of the reasons you threw out there? Okay, so I heard somebody say Passover. So what about Passover? Is that you, Jim, hiding back there? Yeah. What about Passover? Everyone else is not going to answer now because I called you out. Yeah.
They're up against the time crunch.
There is a time crunch. Okay, so here's the thing. If they're going to get Jesus on trial before the Roman governor, he only holds court in the morning. This is a weird Roman thing. It's like bank hours, right? So Romans, if you're gonna have a trial in front of a Roman governor, he holds court early in the morning through mid-morning, and that's it. Then he does his private correspondence. Then he does his bathhouse and spa, and he's done for the day. And that's pretty typical for a Roman tribunal, a Roman governor, according to what we know from the evidence. So they have to get it done by Friday, because what happens at Friday at sundown is you have not only a Sabbath, but a high holy Sabbath as Passover starts. And it starts an 8-day festival that goes to the end of the following Sabbath. So it wouldn't be till the end of that you have access to Pilate. And then he's leaving town. So there's no guarantee he's even going to be around. He's going to go back home to Caesarea Maritima. He's only in town for the festival. That doesn't mean that they couldn't put Jesus on trial another way, but there's a prime opportunity here to get the governor to hear the trial of Jesus in town and have it be expedited. rather than taking Jesus like Paul has to do. Remember Paul? He has to actually go back to Caesarea Maritima where he's imprisoned. And the prison's still there, by the way. You can actually there's the archaeological evidence of where Paul was. So that's intriguing to me. That we got to capitalize on this moment, right? We got to nail this down. Sorry. So there's some dynamics to where that is true. Okay. Some other things that would be possible motivations for them. Okay. Why would they do this in secrecy of night? Yeah. So one of the things that's true, I actually just taught on this passage. What day is today? Wednesday. On Monday. Remember when Jesus is being tested? This happened on Tuesday. So just a few days before this, the Pharisees come up to Jesus and the leaders, and they're asking Jesus, by what authority did John do these things? Whose authority do you have, is what they ask Jesus. Like, by what authority are you doing these things? And Jesus flips it and says, by what authority did John do these things? And they're like, oh, dang, if we answer by authority of heaven, they're going to believe John the Baptist because we're endorsing him. And John pointed to Jesus, so we can't answer that. Okay, so what are we going to say? If we say that he was only of man, then the crowd's going to riot against us, to her point, and because they all believed that John was a prophet. So here's what they answered. It's the chief priests. Actually, it's not the Pharisees, it's chief priests. Here's what they answered. They answered, we don't know. At that point, Jesus won the argument. Because if they can't, as chief priests, determine John's baptism, whether it was good or not, that's their job, is to determine whether washings are holy or not, are good or not, effective or not. That's their job, is to decide if a person is doing this on behalf of God. When they say they don't know, they invalidate their ability to judge Jesus' ministry. He's won the argument already. So he doesn't even have to answer. He just walks away. He's like, well, then I'm not going to say by what authority I did this either. Because you can't judge it, obviously. So one of the things that has been true is that the leaders in the city are really afraid of a riot causing. Now, a couple things happen if a riot starts. One is Rome will want someone who's in charge to get in trouble, because your job is to keep the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana. Whether you're Pilate, we'll come to him in a minute, or whether you're the Jewish leaders. If there's a riot, Rome will come in and say, apparently you can't do this job. The other thing that's true is if there's a riot, right, Pilate has evidence against the Jewish leaders at this point. So it puts them between a rock and a hard spot. They don't want to do this, so they don't want to do it while Jesus is, I deleted it again, in the city, in the crowds. The crowds will riot against them. Okay, they're not popular, by the way. In 70 AD, the crowds, part of the reason the rebels overthrow not just Rome, or want to overthrow Rome, but they also overthrow the temple guard and the chief priests, is because they believe them to be corrupt. Same reason why the Essenes moved out of town. They thought the whole system was corrupt. They were right. And so these people know that they're not popular. Okay, the aristocrats, the chief priests, they know that they're not popular. And so this is a likely scenario that's going to take place. You have, if historians are right, 1 million to 2 million people coming into town. They're not townies. They're out-of-towners. And Jerusalem's elite aren't popular, because everyone else has suffered the consequences of the elite in Jerusalem. Like you hear this, right? Like even in our own political dynamics, to where you have like people down in like where the hurricane hit, and they're talking about people on the other side, people north of Richmond, those kinds of things. Like we have that kind of sentimentality that says, oh, I'm going to get mine because they're elitist in their own way. So that is definitely true. So a couple other things that I put on there is that they actually have kind of a unique opportunity thanks to Judas, right? He gives them this opportunity to get Jesus in secrecy. You realize this is like before the days of video cameras on every street corner. I said that last time. It's not like they can track Jesus' credit card and go, where is he? Right? So they need an insider to be like, hey, I'll tell you how to find him during this particular moment in time. And Judas gives them that opportunity. So Judas comes. He comes with this detachment of soldiers. Is it 600 people or so? Apparently, that's the term that's used. Mark's gospel says that when Jesus is flogged and beaten and mocked, it was a detachment of soldiers that did that to him. That's Mark's gospel. So a crowd of 600 guys, and they're playing mock king. It's actually a game not only in the ancient world but in the medieval world, where you dress up a person, specifically an enemy, you dress them up like the enemy or as a king, and you mock them. That's what they're playing. And you can kind of picture this, because even in the atrocities of our own history, sometimes soldiers have gone too far. right? And so you have this dynamic that plays out. If it's 600 men, it seems to be that's the term that's used, or around that number that is used. But that said, John really does portray, verses 4 through 9, he really does portray Jesus as being sovereign and in control. You might remember the phrase, "My hour has not yet come, my hour has not yet come." And then Jesus says, "Now is the hour." It's like he's in charge of time and all of the moving pieces. He's a master chess player. And this somewhat culminates with that. He knew that this was going to happen. Well, maybe it's just because he saw them coming. But I love the scene. I don't know exactly what happens in this scene, because we just kind of go here. Let's pretend it can't be me. Lindsay is the person I'm going to talk about. Lindsay's in the back. Lindsay's my friend. Sorry to bring you into this. All right, so Lindsay is Jesus and the disciples, and you all are coming out to meet her. And Lindsay, Jesus in this moment says, or you all are kind of looking for Jesus, and Jesus steps forward and says, "I am Jesus. I am he, the one you're looking for." Now, you all fall down. I don't know why. Like in John's gospel, I don't know why. Now, two options. Sorry, Lindsay, that's the end of talking about Lindsay. I had to pick on you because you came in. All right, so a couple things are possible. Here's number one. The soldiers are shocked by the fact that they're coming out to get this rebel, this revolutionary, this patriot. They're coming out to get this guy. If you're a Roman soldier, you're ready for a fight. And this guy's been called, a terrorist. If you're Rome, he's a terrorist. If you're Jewish, he's a patriot. You know how this goes, a freedom fighter. So he steps out, and you have Judas with you who's like, "I have a secret sign." John doesn't mention the secret sign. "I have a sign, the one in my kiss, right, is him. I'm going to identify him. As a friend, I'm going to walk up and give a sign of intimacy. And then you arrest him." Instead, what John's gospel says, Jesus is like, "I'm he, I'm the one you're looking for." And maybe this just shocks them, and they're like, "Whoa!" And they're like, "Whoa, we're not used to this." That's possibility number one. Possibility number two, and maybe it's both, is this phrase, "I am." John has used it throughout the gospel. 7 I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the good shepherd. And this phrase has an echo all the way back to Moses and the burning bush. Whenever God reveals himself, guess what humans tend to do? They tend to fall to their knees or fall down. Right? Isaiah chapter 6. "I saw the Lord seated on the throne, and I knew I was sinful, and I fell down." Or Jesus in the boat with Peter, "Get away from me, I'm a sinful man." Maybe there is just a response that is innate. They don't actually know why they fell down. But there's something about Jesus, and when he says that name, I am, it just causes them to fall down to their knees. We do hear, by the way, Philippians 2, 5 through 11 says that there's one day every knee will bow at the name of Jesus. Maybe this is a prelude, a preview of that even if you don't want to, you will actually fall down before the one who is the creator, who is the judge. I don't know, but I can see how John would allude to that, and I could see how it could be both, either or. And I'm okay with it kind of being a nebulous, sure, which one. So let me pause and ask, Jesus is going to be arrested. Let me pause and ask, any questions about that thus far? Peter's not yet swung his sword, but any questions about that? Okay. So then Peter attempts to save Jesus. Oh, Peter. I love Peter. Too many times I'm like, I'm a disciple like Peter. Why do you think the Gospels and I don't know, the New Testament, why do you think they put Peter out there like in front so often? Why? Obviously, in part because like he took on part of that role as one of the spokespersons for the disciples. I think the other reason is sometimes like we see Peter in us. And I think Peter's actually put out there as an imperfect disciple because we're all imperfect disciples. Now, the other disciples, they get their press and they get their time too. Doubting Thomas will get his time, right? John, the believing disciple, will get his time. So we'll see the other disciples, but Peter especially has these moments where like, oh, yeah, I can relate to that. And he'll figure into this story quite a bit. So John tells us Peter is going to fight for Jesus. Now, the other Gospels tell this story too. John tells us the name of the servant, Malchus. Perhaps it's because that story has been told, but John is part of the priestly family. We're going to see that in a minute when they go into the priestly family's home. John's the one who gets Peter and John in. He has an in. He has access. So maybe the main reason he tells us the name is like he knows this guy. I don't know. Or at least the story has been told in the family and retold in the family. That seems very likely. There are two swords, Luke's gospel tells us. So I want to kind of put this scenario, like what does Peter think he's going to do? 600 people. He's a fisherman. It's highly possible that some of these, if not the majority of these, are Roman soldiers and a detachment of temple guard. So, unless you're, I don't know, a ninja turtle. I don't even know. Like, what does he think? They have 2 swords. And even those swords are more like machetes, right? So, but you gotta at least honor the bravery of Peter in this moment. And so he swings. Now, I don't know this. How does he cut off Malchus's ear? Like, take a sword and go try to swing at somebody and just hit their ear, right? Like, you're hitting their ear and you're slicing into collarbone, right? This is the only thing I can think of that possibly happened. Peter wasn't aiming to take off his ear. Like, maybe he was aiming to go right down center skull, right? And, sorry for that vivid picture. But my hunch is Peter's taking out the sword and he's going, right? He's swinging. And what's Malchus doing at the same time? It's his right ear. He's ducking. And Peter can't even do this right? So he swings. I think, it's not like my faith is dependent on this, but I think he ducks and he hits. Any other possible scenarios? Because you guys might change my opinion on that. Any other possible scenarios? I don't think he walks up and is like, here, and cuts off his ear, right? I just don't think that that's exactly what happened. So we have this scenario. Notice he went for a servant, not for one of the soldiers. I think that's funny too, right? Like, there's the weak guy. Let's go after him, right? I think that that's kind of funny. That's somewhat humorous. But obviously, Jesus did not find this particular moment humorous, right? But it's a mismatch. And so you can see these bullet points. And yet, Luke tells us, well, not really. Later, Jesus would say in the dynamic that, I could have called legions of angels. In fact, you see me kind of do some of the math there, and don't be precise with the math. 72,000 angels or whatever it would be, depending on how big you see these legions as. Legions varied in number depending on which legion you were and when we're talking about in the history of Rome. But the reality is, if Jesus could have called them at 72,000 angels to, 600 men, and 2 Kings would have a few things to say about that. Open your eyes and see the armies of the Lord surround us. That kind of a dynamic. By the way, the sword, that word sword, those words have meaning, but they kind of vary. Think of the world pre-industrial revolution. So swords aren't produced in a factory, right? So it's not like there's this, brand of sword and this brand of sword. So those words have a little bit of fluidity to them. So the size of that is sometimes something that varies when it comes to the historical reconstruction. So that becomes kind of an interesting dynamic, an interesting story. Why does John tell it? Why do the Gospels tell it? I think it is another example of Peter and another example of Peter being Peter and a disciple, right? Obviously, this is not Jesus's path. This is not his will, his resistance. Blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And there may be some things that we need to reflect on when it comes to that as well, of Jesus saying, when is it appropriate? For self-preservation or for the protection of others? Because I think there is a time, right? There is a time. And yet we have to be holistic with our interpretation of that and understanding of that. Yeah. That's a good question. That's actually a really good thought. And one of the things that's interesting about even John writing is John seems to really want to humble Peter. Now, even beating Peter to the tomb, Peter beating him to the tomb, but I went in first and I believe first. There's this weird play. But then at the end of the gospel, the epilogue, there's another weird play of how long is he going to? They sound like two brothers. So I can see that. Mark's gospel, if church tradition is right, if Mark's gospel is Mark interpreting Peter or kind of being a scribe for Peter, Mark's gospel is also pretty hard on Peter, though. And so it's interesting that those are the two gospels that are pretty hard. Not that the others aren't, but there's definitely some points of pokiness with John's gospel and Mark's gospel. I don't know that by 90 AD that we have what happens later on, 300 years later, to where Peter is elevated above the other apostles. In many ways, even into the first century, he's more viewed as a spokesperson or a line leader. Like a line leader in school, they're not greater than the rest of their classmates, they're just first. And so he seems to be viewed more that way, but there is definitely a dynamic of he's not the ideal. If you're going to put a leader in front, He's a flawed leader. Just like Paul says, formerly I was a blasphemer. I was the foremost of sinners, but Jesus died for me. Therefore, I'm the perfect example for you. And I think Peter's kind of portrayed that way. That's a really good question. Yeah. Other thoughts, other questions? Okay. I don't know if you can tell, I love this stuff. So if you need me to slow down, please let me slow down, okay? So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to enter into the trial phase. Notice that in John, that really just covers verse 12 through verse 40 of chapter 18. What I've given you in that first section is a compilation of not only John, but the synoptic gospels. Because we're going into Holy Week next week, it might be advantageous for you to reflect on these phases of the trial, especially as you get into Thursday night, overnight into Friday. Not saying you should stay up all night, but I've had people do that, to where they actually stay up the night with Jesus and reflect. Not a bad thought. Last time I pulled an overnighter was in probably driving to my family on vacation, but maybe Florida drive. Before that, it was probably one class in college, one night, and I was like, never again. But our church used to do a 24-hour prayer thing. And we would wake up in the middle of the night, and we would pray a prayer and just reflect on that hour. Now, I'm not prone to go back to sleep once I wake up, but maybe think through this, like Thursday night, Passover, Kidron Valley, betrayal. And then we start walking through the Jewish phases of the trial. Those happen before early morning. Okay, so these are happening while it's still dark, first hours of the morning. We're talking middle of the night morning. But we have three phases. John's going to allude to Annas, and we'll talk about him in a minute. John is the only gospel to talk about this phase of the trial. So this is why it's a compilation. We're taking the gospels, we're harmonizing them. Okay, the second phase is Caiaphas. All of the gospels talk about Caiaphas. He's the Roman appointed high priest. We'll come back to him in a second. Then phase 3, Luke is the one who, I think Luke and Matthew deal with this. Jesus is brought before the entire Sanhedrin to kind of get the final stamp of approval. We won't talk about them again. These are the 70 Jewish leaders that were both Pharisee and Sadducean. Maybe even some others in there. But these 70 Jewish leaders were kind of the high court of Israel. They had a place in the temple where they met. So these 70 leaders, that's why Jesus sent out 72 or 70. He's reappointing new leaders. Pretty political statement. So they are the ones to stamp it before they go to Pilate. Okay. Then there's 3 Roman phases of the trial. We'll deal with the first one. Well, I guess we'll deal with all 3 of them tonight, but really Pilate's the only one that we see in John's gospel. So we'll have Pilate, then Luke takes Jesus and takes him to Herod Antipas because Jesus is from his jurisdiction in Galilee. He's not actually from Pilate's jurisdiction. And so this is Pilate's way to get out of the whole thing, is be like, oh, he's from your area. Guess you can deal with him. And it's after this moment that Luke's gospel tells us Pilate and Herod became friends, or friends means more like political allies, more than like buddy-buddy, they went out and golfed together. That's not what that means. But they became political allies after this moment. So those 3 phases, we're actually going to more see 1 and 3 of the Roman phase in John's gospel. Is this trial, and I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit, is this trial overnight unlawful? Maybe, maybe not. Later on, there'll be some codification that says that the Jewish high courts can't do this kind of a thing, but that's about 100 years later, 150 years later. I think there's still some hints that this is not a just trial, but I don't know that it was codified by this particular point of time. This is more than an official trial, more like an interrogation. I think you all have watched plenty of movies to know, we're not waterboarding, but we're pretty close, right? We're putting something over someone's face and we're asking them to prophesy and we're punching them, right? We're mocking them and they're without sleep. Like, this is an interrogation. Let's view it for what it really is. And so they're trying to cause charges and trump up charges against Jesus. And as we walk through the rest of our content tonight, I want you to notice that there are going to be we're going to build a case, right? Jewish allegations. And by that, I mean the chief priests dominantly, but the Pharisees as well. So the Sanhedrin, So there's going to be Jewish allegations. And then there's going to be Roman allegations that they need to codify that night so that they can take Jesus to Pilate. You'll notice that these accusations overlap a bit, but they're markedly different than these allegations that they actually bring to Pilate. So they're going to say here, guilty of blasphemy is going to be an example. We'll get to it in a minute. But here they're going to say, oh yeah, this guy claims to be king and says you don't have to pay taxes. My tax day, I just paid taxes this week. Some of you paid it a long time ago. Some of you, it's time, okay? So, like, they're going to have Roman charges. Okay, so we're going to notice that, and we'll just kind of peek ahead. Who are these people? All right, so we're back up. Annas and Caiaphas, that bullet point if you see it. Annas is, if you're Jewish, he's more legitimately your high priest. Because high priests in the Jewish system were high priests for life. It's like, judges in the high court, right? So federal judges, right? You're on that court for life. Okay, so this, typically in a Jewish system, that person would be the high priest for life. He's not dead yet, obviously. But here's the problem. The Jewish political powers don't actually run Israel. The Romans do. You're occupied. There's an occupational army, an occupational power. There's an emperor, a Caesar, who's over you. So Rome actually gets to appoint the priest. So there's a Jewish priest that they would recognize, Annas, and there's a Roman appointed priest that they would recognize. Now, Romans are politically savvy. They don't necessarily want to cause a stir, so they keep it all in the family. And after Annas is priest, they appoint the high priesthood to his sons and to his son-in-law. His son-in-law's name is Caiaphas. So you'll notice there's a gap between Annas and Caiaphas. That's the gap where the son-in-laws are serving. Herod the Great, back when Jesus was born, was the Roman power, the puppet king, and he appointed high priests. He was the one who did. In fact, when he married his wife Mariamne, because she was a Hasmonean princess and he wanted to have political power, he appointed her brother as the high priest, and that's the same high priest that he baptized in Jericho, as in like buried him in water until he quit bubbling. Okay, he took him to a spa and drowned him. So Romans were adept at appointing priests for their own puppet purposes. These are puppets. Okay, so hear that. If you're Jewish, you likely would not have seen them as all that authentic. It's why the Essenes said, everything's corrupt, we're out of here, we're starting our own people that would be more legitimate out in the wilderness. So a couple other things that would be true. Caiaphas specifically was not appointed by Pilate. But Pilate, as governor, would have the responsibility of re-upping Caiaphas. So can you start to see some political tension forming? Okay. Caiaphas was not Pilate's choice. Caiaphas was the choice of his predecessor, the previous governor. Pilate is going to have the opportunity to reappoint a different high priest. Interesting, as we see kind of some of the interactions that play out. Okay, so all of that is true. John alludes to a prophecy Caiaphas made earlier. We've already talked about it. Isn't it better that one person die for the kingdom? John's going to bring that back up in this particular moment. Okay, so that's interesting. We're going to talk quite a bit more about Pilate. Any questions about Annas and Caiaphas and how the priests ruled or some of the political dynamics going on there? Yeah.
When they make these treks to all these political judges, are they all still within Jerusalem? Because it seems like that's a lot of judges in that one area where they
Yeah.
actually go.
So the 70 I think would be located, from a wider region. It's the chief priests and the Sadducees that seem to be more congregated, and not that they would never go outside of that region, but seem to be more like the congregation of the power, or the central of the power is there. It's a good question. Because Pharisees are coming in and out of town. Okay, it's a good question. And that's the term elders at times is used to refer to that kind of a person who's just seen as one of the elders of the tribes. Now it's more of a less tribal, it's more regional. It's a good question. Yeah, other questions about that? Okay. So we're going to talk about Pilate in a second. Let's, this is what we need to deal with instead. Okay, so John, as the trial of Jesus unfolds, you'll notice I'm going to use a word that I don't know that is even relevant anymore. John describes the trial of Jesus and the trial of Peter like a soap opera. I need to come up with a better word. This is my professor's way to describe it, but I don't know that I've ever seen a full soap opera. I think I've seen, it was on TV at the gym, that kind of a thing, like the doctor's office had it on up there. I think this is true. I've not seen a soap opera, so I'm going to confess, maybe that's a good confession, but I'm going to confess, what I know about this is that soap operas go from scene to scene to scene to scene to scene. right? They pop in and out of scenes, and they weave a story together. Like things progress from the different scenes. I'm not even going to ask you. I'm not going to ask, am I right? Because then you have to confess if you watch soap operas. Okay, so this is what's going to be true of Jesus and Peter. Is unlike some of the synoptic gospels, John is going to weave these stories together. And if we're in a house, and my drawings are terrible, I'm sorry. If we're in a house, houses often had a central courtyard. Okay, so here's Peter, okay? And Jesus is somewhere in one of these rooms. And probably being taken, this is a fairly large complex. So think of like, I don't know, an Italian or a French a villa, right? Like think of, I've never been to one of those, but let's just like, you just recognize like we're talking about not a house, 900 square foot house. We're talking about a complex, a compound, right? And so Jesus is going to be moved between Annas, and I think Caiaphas likely lives there as well. Okay, so he's going to be moved from place to place. And in the meantime, Peter's down here in the courtyard with some of the servants and some of the soldiers. He's warming himself. John tells us, please hold on to this imagery till later. He's warming himself by a charcoal fire. John is unique in telling us that particular detail because it's going to come up in the epilogue. Have you ever had a bad day and there's something that like gets fried into your, like etched into your brain, and every time you see that, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that day. Maybe it's just me. Okay, there are certain moments, flashbacks that I have where I'm like, yep, that was dumb. That was not a dumb idea. There's a place on the bike trail, this is way off topic, place on the bike trail behind Ozark, Frisco Trail, where when my son was little, I'm like, you ought to ride down that ramp and try to jump that ramp. It was great, and I filmed it until he hit the tree. It was awesome. And so then I was like, don't tell your mom that we did that, right? So it's like every time we drive by, I'm like, oh yeah, that was dumb. So here's this moment. Peter's going to have kind of this moment around the charcoal fire that he's going to regret. And of course, that brings us back to the epilogue. Luke's gospel, while Peter is making these denials, and at the third denial, Luke's gospel says that Jesus catches eye contact with Peter. It says he looked directly at him. And Luke's gospel, you don't want Jesus to look directly at you. It's usually because it's like mom catching you doing something, right? It's like he's able, you know this about Jesus, he's able to see through you and see into you and know you. And this is part of why Peter in the other gospels, he leaves and he weeps bitterly. That term of weeping bitterly is the idea of like can't catch your breath sobbing, like as if someone had died. It's used to describe a funeral cry. So he's feeling like he's death in this betrayal. So that is interesting. Now here's the cool thing about this moment. Obviously you're fairly familiar. I guess not obviously. You're likely fairly familiar with Peter's. I don't know the man. I don't know the man. I don't know the man. If you take all four Gospels and put them together, you recognize that this happens likely in crowds of different like groupings of people. And so there's like servant girls and there's, servants, and it happens in these little groups. And it's kind of this ongoing narrative that's this dark, kind of confusing, you kind of think of somebody trying to retell something that happened in a late night, overnight kind of thing. And the eyewitness testimony, in my mind, looks very accurate of this kind of thing. Of like, boy, there's lots of details and there's lots going on in this particular story. But 3 times, I don't know the man. What we have kind of in this next bullet point, the last bullet point of that paragraph, is something I just want to point to, and we can't talk about it much. But if you were going to point over to Acts chapter 4, one of the cool things that happens is Peter and John, as in Peter and I believe it's this John, are actually on trial in front of the chief priests. They are no longer down here in the courtyard. Peter and John are on trial here in front of the chief priests, the same positions, some of the same people. And this time, Peter gets a retrial. He gets a do-over. And it's interesting because you can't count it. It's close to 3. I wish it was exactly 3, but it's not exactly 3. You'd have to force it a little bit. But he's like, the name of Jesus, the name of Jesus. How are you saved? By the name of Jesus. And it's like, I'm not going to get it wrong again. Have you ever had that kind of moment where you're like, I remember being here? Like he's in Acts 4, he's able to look down at the same spot. If they're in the same, he's in front of the same people. I'm assuming it's the same spot. It's at least the same people. And I know Peter's like, I'm not going to get this wrong again. The name of Jesus, the name of Jesus. I know the man, I know the man, I know the man. I think he's kind of going off on that. So I want you to hear, not only at the end of John's gospel is Peter restored, but Peter actually grows through this. Can I say this is your discipleship? You will sometimes grow because of your failures. Like sometimes your failures are your best teacher. And Jesus can use your failures to teach you and strengthen you for what to do better next time. Right? Have you ever had one of those moments where a failure taught you so much that you have a reaction to just do the exact opposite the next time you do it? Right? I have this often. I one time missed a meeting with an elder's wife when I was a preacher. She's a good friend of mine, really good friend of mine, but she's also like pretty intense personality. And I missed a meeting because she just on Sunday came up to me after my sermon, was like, hey, can we meet this Wednesday? I was like, sure, that'd be great. Well, I was doing a hospital call. I was out and she came to the office and I wasn't there. She's like, man, that really hurt. It made me feel like I wasn't important. I'm like, oh, I let her down. It changed how I set up meetings for the rest of my life. Like now I'm like, oh, you want to have a meeting? Email me, because I know my tendency is to forget if you don't email me. That little story, and I know that's a stupid story, but that little story, like you see that so much more in Peter, where he's like, I'm not getting this wrong again. Right? I'm not going to deny Jesus. And so I would encourage us, if you have failures, use them as a platform to stand on top of those and allow Jesus to build strength inside of you. I love that about the restoration of Peter. And we'll talk more about that in the charcoal fire as we move forward. So we come then, you kind of see, Jesus kind of flash back to the trial before Caiaphas, and not a ton there that's maybe new or that we need to continue to unpack, but you see kind of this back and forth between Peter and the trial before Caiaphas. So I'm going to skip down to verse 28 if you're trying to follow along in the text. We're chapter 18, verse 28. So it's at this point of time where they take Jesus out from Caiaphas' house and they take him to the praetorium, or the governor's headquarters. So one of the questions that comes up is like, where is this? And there's really a couple options. One is the praetorium, by the way, is wherever Herod or wherever Pilate has set up office. So let me clarify, because I just stuttered and said three names. The praetorium is wherever the governor sets up his office and sets up court. That's where he's at. So he is likely in two spaces in Jerusalem. One would be Herod's palace inside the city, and we kind of know where that's at if you ever want to look it up on a archaeological map. But inside the city, or he's in the fortress of Antonia, just that building north of the castle, north of the temple. He's in one of those two spots, highly likely. So if you're ever tourist over in Jerusalem, you kind of know this may be one of the places where Jesus was on trial and maybe flogged. Now in Jerusalem, they're going to take you to both of them and, convince you that both of them are authentic and that this post is exactly the post that Jesus was flogged on. We'll talk about that next week, but I go, maybe. But I would say it's highly likely that we're in one of those two places. Now, normally, this is not where Pilate's from. Normally, Pilate's office, if you will, if this is Jerusalem on the map, okay, and these are the mountains that go to the Dead Sea, Pilate's office would be all the way on the other side near the coast of the Mediterranean, right? So this is the Mediterranean. There's a port city that Herod the Great built called Caesarea, Caesar town, right? Maritima, as in like the ocean, the sea. So it's a port city. It's very Gentile. You can Google Earth this. The Roman concrete that they poured to create the harbor is still there. The Romans perfected the use of hydraulic concrete. Crazy. Here's the other crazy thing about it. The port, the shape of the port, you can see it under the water, is the same shape as a little bit south of here. There's a modern day port. It's larger, but the shape is exactly the same. In other words, the technology hasn't changed all that much. If you go to Caesarea Maritima, this is also where you can stand where Paul was on trial, the palace that's there. You can go to the horse track that's there and sit in the stands of the horse track that's there. It's pretty incredible. But this is where Pilate was from. He would have come into town, had his own triumphal parade entourage coming into town. And so he's here for the festival, and that's part of the dynamic that's taken place. Let's see. Okay. Here's where I want to pause and go a little bit slower. I want to ask this question. We have plenty of time. What was the political pressure that Pilate was under when he is walking with Jesus through this trial? So in a weird way, I need you to turn to the last page. We'll come back. It's kind of an appendices, at the end of the document. There's a bullet point that says Pilate's provocations and political pressures. And these are from three different sources: Josephus, Philo, who's Jewish. Both of those are Jewish sources, and New Testament sources, the Gospel of Luke specifically. So what we want to do is try to reconstruct a scene. Some of you who've watched The Chosen or movies, you'll hear hints of these kinds of things, but these are fairly common scenes that are known of Pilate. So what we want to do is take these scenes, these provocations, these pressures, and reconstruct a motivation for Pilate doing what he does. Because he clearly in the Gospels thinks that Jesus is innocent. Even his wife says, "have nothing to do with this man." About 7 times, Pilate declares Jesus innocent. That's not insignificant, right? That Pilate actually, if he's going to give a judgment, he actually says, this guy's innocent. That's actually the judgment he gives. And yet he does the exact opposite. So why? It's a really good question. So some things you need to know. Pilate has already had run-ins with the Jewish leaders. There's already been multiple run-ins. Now, the timing of Jesus' death is 2 possible dates. One is 30 AD. The other is 33 AD, specifically April 3rd. April 3rd, 30, I was making sure it wasn't April 3rd. April 3rd, 33 AD. I lean toward that second date. April 3rd, 33 AD. I lean toward that second date. There's evidence for both. I'm okay with both. Why do we know it's one of those? Passover following different dates, but also the dating of different rulers, their deaths, and their reigns. So you put that together, you come up with those 2 dates. So some things that we know about Pilate that have already happened before the trial of Jesus. So bullet point number 1. Pilate commissioned, he was over in Caesarea Maritima, and while he was there, he commissioned that Roman standards, if you've watched movies about Rome, they have flags or statuaries on top of poles, and they march with those. So if you're a legion, you march with a standard. You have that in front of you. This kind of imagery, we're fairly familiar with this, right? You think about like Nazi Germany putting up a swastika, and it represents something that's significant. So when it comes to these Roman standards, Pilate commissions Roman standards to be brought into Jerusalem. This pretty Gentile city, even though it's still in Israel, pretty Gentile city. This pretty kosher city, you're going to cause a problem. We don't know exactly where he commissions them to be put, but it's highly likely that he puts them where? On the Fortress of Antonia or in the palace where he's going to reside. Whether it's inscriptions or imagery, icons, in other words, graven images, that's likely the scenario, the Jewish people protest. Now, Josephus tells us they protest, they send a delegation of protesters, official delegates, back to Caesarea to protest this. Meanwhile, there's protests, riots that are happening in the streets in Jerusalem. If Josephus is right, it says that Pilate commissions soldiers to go suppress the rioters. It sounds like scenes in a TV show, or it sounds like scenes in the news. And so he commissions protest police to go against these. Now, in this particular story, I think I put this here. Yeah, he has soldiers surround the crowd. Okay, so now all of a sudden you're a crowd, you're surrounded by soldiers. You're protesting, and he threatens them with death. If you don't stop, we will kill you on behalf of Rome, for the sake of the peace of Rome. Sounds like the Hunger Games. There's a reason for that. Okay, so we'll slaughter you. So here's what happens. I'm not going to ask you to reenact this. They lay down. And they take their necks and they go, okay. Peaceful protest. But they lay down and they bare their necks. That's the same thing the Jewish people did to the Greeks during the Maccabean revolt. Some of those same things, like, we'll die for this. Don't test us because we'll die for it. Well, Pilate's stuck. He can't actually do that at this particular moment in time. He's fairly new governor at this particular moment in time. And so he ends up kind of relenting in this moment. Like, they win. Point number 1 to the Jewish protesters and leaders, right? So then around that same time, the timing of this is a little bit more uncertain. That letter C, by the way, when you see that in history, means circa or around this time. So it means we don't know the exact date, but it's around this same time. But likely a little bit later, Pilate's going to go inside the temple in Jerusalem. Man, this guy doesn't learn his lesson. And he's going to take money out of it. Now, if you're in a Roman city, that's normal. The temple is the place where you go, and the god is giving to the city by building water, aqueducts, to bring water to the city. The god is building that. So if you're Roman, that's a pretty normal thing to do, to say, hey, guess what? This God, whatever the God is, your patron, your benefactor, is building you a water aqueduct. Praise be the God, right? So Pilate's just doing what other governors are allowed to do. He's going and getting money. But of course, that's not that's not within the sentiment of, especially the aristocrats who are in charge of the money there. So again, we have this moment that happens where, again, what happens this time is Herod knows he's learned his lesson. He sends undercover soldiers into the crowd. right? And this time they start beating the crowd there. It's kind of just a different tactic. Like, let's try this one. And if Josephus is telling the truth, like, yes, this eventually suppressed the demonstrators there, but you can look up that story in Josephus. Then Luke tells us of an unknown incident where Herod killed some Galileans, so some people from the north, while they were down in Jerusalem making sacrifices. I don't know if they were rioting. I don't know what was happening. But apparently he killed them while they were making their sacrifice, and the blood mingled with their sacrifice. That's also some things that the Greeks did during that Maccabean revolt 160 years earlier. He looks like their enemy. So Luke is the one who tells us that. It doesn't make the news because I think these kinds of things happened quite a bit, right? So it doesn't make major historical news, especially in the greater Roman world. Why? This is like outskirts of the Roman Empire. You don't tell those stories in the major newspaper of Rome. Okay. Then another story that happens, again, around this same time, it's later than the previous two, but around this same time, is that Herod's going to bring in golden shields this time, and these don't have an image on them, they just have an inscription on them dedicated to Emperor Tiberius. Pilate needs to be on good terms with Emperor Tiberius. We'll tell you why in just a minute, at least a possible reconstruction. So he hangs them in the Herod's palace, which is one of the places where we think he possibly is when he's holding this particular court case. Again, Pilate's erupted. This time, the people take it all the way to Tiberius Caesar, and Herod has to relent. Like it doesn't turn into one of the massacres or one of the incidents. After Jesus' trial, there's another story of Pilate going north, way north, actually between Galilee and Judea, and having a massacre of Samaritans at their site of their temple, Mount Gerizim. All that to say this, like Herod the Great massacring babies in Bethlehem, this is not outside of Pilate's like normal modus operandi. To have kind of a political situation where he acts in an unjust way. So what is happening with Pilate? Let me add one more piece of this one is more of a possibility than an absolute than the others. We have historical evidence for the others. There's some historical evidence that this is possible. In Rome, there's a guy named Sejanus. You can look this up. And you can read about this yourself. There's a guy named Sejanus. He was part of the Praetorian Guard. So, if you watch Star Wars, the guys that wear red inside the Emperor Palpatine's, circle. I'm not a big Star Wars guy. But they're part of the Praetorian Guard. He ends up becoming a pretty high official in the Emperor Tiberius's leadership cabinet, for the sake of modern-day equivalents. Tiberius has been outside of Rome. He's been on an island called Capri, like as in Capri Suns. Okay, he's in an island called Capri. Don't look up on the internet all that happens in the island of Capri. It's we have modern day equivalents of it, like Epstein Island, like all of that. It's all of that, like kids dressing up and people dressing up and all kinds of play acting and all kinds of Roman gross. Okay, and so Tiberius has been away. So Sejanus, the story goes, and there's evidence for this, Sejanus, he's kind of leading because Tiberius isn't there, and that leadership kind of moves toward like accusations of trying to dethrone Tiberius. So, at that sense, betrayal. And he becomes an enemy of Tiberius. Now, Sejanus was anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. Here's what I don't know. Pilate is appointed during the time that Sejanus is making a lot of these decisions. So there's quite a few scholars that debate this, quite a few scholars that believe it's highly likely that Sejanus is the one who appointed Pilate. Sejanus is known for his anti-Semitism, his anti-Jewish policies. Tiberius has anti-Jewish policies as well until he learns about Sejanus' treachery and then has Sejanus killed. And then there is a program where they start tracking down other cohorts with Sejanus and tracking them down to deal with them. And sometimes it's exile, sometimes it's death. I don't know if Pilate is experiencing this pressure. If our date is 30 AD, maybe not so much, because notice Sejanus is executed 31 AD, October 18th, exactly 31 AD. So it may be that this is building and Pilate feels the pressure, or if some of the evidence that points to AD 33 is true, it's 2 years or a year and a half after this, and we're dealing with like the ramifications. So let me bring this back to the trials, okay? Why does Pilate, even though he knows Jesus is innocent, why does he hand Jesus over to be crucified? I think a couple reasons. I think number one, I'm pretty sold on this. Pilate doesn't want to lose his position. The Jewish leaders, notice I'm not saying the Jewish people. Notice I'm not saying that. Okay, otherwise we'd be falling into Sejanus' era of anti-Semitism. So we're talking about the Jewish leaders, even the Jewish people would be like, yeah, like they were corrupt. The rabbis later would be like, yeah, they were corrupt. The Essenes, yeah, they're corrupt. So the Jewish leaders have Pilate between a rock and a hard place. He's already gotten in trouble with Rome. They've already won in the whole shield incident by appealing to Tiberius. Rome is okay to replace these kinds of governors in the outskirts. It's not a big deal for them to replace a governor like this. It's happened before. They'll do it again. So for Pilate to maintain his position of power, he has to maintain the peace. One of the ways to maintain the peace is to maintain the peace with the leaders who are the local leaders there. I think that's one of Paul's major motivations, why he doesn't listen to his wife who says, I had a bad dream. It's also why I think he says, I'm washing my hands of this man's blood. He knows he's not making a just decision. Right? I'm washing my hands of this man's blood. His blood be on your hands, on your children. And the crowd, of course, says, his blood be on us. It's not all the Jewish crowd, the same crowd that came in to Jerusalem with the donkey. Right? It's not necessarily the same crowd. But I think that's part of Pilate's thing. Now, the other piece the Sejanus piece might be that it even just amplifies it even more, that already people who have been seen as anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, are seen as aligning with Sejanus, are being killed for it. Not for being anti-Semitic, but because of their political alignment with Sejanus. If Pilate was appointed by him and he's anti-Semitic, how much more of a case can be built against him that he's with Sejanus and was part of the co-conspirators? Okay, so yeah, it could cause, and I just don't know that last piece. That first piece, I go, I'm pretty sold on that. That last piece, I go, that's interesting, and I can see how that would play out. Okay, that was a bit. So let me just pause on Pilate and go, okay, questions about Pilate. We'll come back to Barabbas next week. Okay, questions on Pilate. So here's where we'll pick up next week then, because we didn't quite get to it, and I didn't know if we would, because I knew it would be a lot. We're going to ask this question of like, did the Jewish people have the right to execute people? And the answer is kind of like, kind of. So we'll pick up there, but we're going to really rather quickly get to Barabbas and talk about that quick little scene. Notice in John's gospel it's pretty quick. And then definitely crucifixion. So please come back next week. Friends, thank you. There's a lot of historical background stuff today, so thank you for hanging with me. I find that interesting and helpful. Hopefully you do as well. Typically, they can do this. And I'm going to recommend they do it before they sign up. Or around half an hour. Because, like, well,